At the beginning of 1945, the Red Army of the Soviet Union entered Germany to fight the last battles of World War II. The Third Reich was on the brink of the abyss, and the Nazis were hemmed in on all sides. Hitler and his most important generals would soon take refuge in the Führer bunker below the Chancellery in Berlin, from where they would try to direct the war efforts without much success. The Soviet advance was overwhelming, and in just 3 months they reached the German capital. The bloody Battle of Berlin claimed the lives of thousands of people, and was the last price to pay to end the war. In the midst of the violent combats that were taking place in the streets, a curious situation arose among the soldiers. The Soviets, emboldened by the imminent defeat of Nazism, began to laugh at their enemies' desperate efforts to save the remains of their city. The Germans were the targets of cruel humor, though there was nothing they could do about it. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you how the Russians made fun of the Nazis who defended Berlin. Are you ready? Let's get started. On January 12, 1945, the Red Army began its march on German territory. They advanced at a rate of 40 kilometers per day, practically without stopping to rest, and after defeating an attempted Nazi resistance outside the capital, they arrived in the city of Berlin. Since the beginning of March, the inhabitants of the town were already aware that they would have to fight the Soviets, so defense preparations began. The Russian troops were commanded mainly by Georgy Zhukov and Vasily Chukov, while on the other side, the responsibility for repelling the communist forces fell to General Helmuth Weidling. The Red Army had a staggering 2.3 million men, supported by more than 6,000 tanks, 7,500 aircraft, and 40,000 artillery pieces. The Germans, on the other hand, were in an indisputable situation of military inferiority. They had at their disposal some 750,000 soldiers, 1,500 tanks, 2,000 planes, and 9,000 artillery pieces. To make matters worse, the defenders of Berlin were not war veterans, but were mostly conscripted militiamen, disorganized, underfed and poorly trained remnants of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, and some volunteers from the Hitler Youth. When the Führer assigned Helmuth Weidling the mission of leading the Berlin forces, the commander accepted, although he later commented that he would have preferred to be shot rather than carry such a weight. The German combatants were almost all older than 50 or younger than 18, because the men of appropriate age to fight had perished in the course of the war. All the elements were in place for the result to be absolute carnage. In the midst of this massacre, taunts and humor were given at the expense of the Germans. On April 16, the Soviet offensive began, attacking the Berlin region from 3 different fronts and surrounding the inexperienced Nazi troops. 5 days later, they arrived at a German barracks south of Berlin. The officers inside, seeing that it was inevitable that they would be overwhelmed by the Russians, contacted the Führer bunker and asked permission to flee. Hitler himself ordered them to stay and resist as long as possible. However, the officers thought twice, and came to the conclusion that it was preferable to disobey the dictator rather than be Stalin's prisoners. They left the barracks just in time, so when the Soviets entered the place they found only 4 privates, 3 of whom surrendered without a fight. The 4th was too drunk to do anything. The Russians were searching the store when suddenly a phone began to ring. The barracks telephone lines were connected to the main Wehrmacht bases. When they answered the call, on the other side they heard the voice of a high-ranking Nazi official, who communicated to find out what was happening there. The Soviet soldier replied in Russian, "Ivan is here, go to hell," and hung up. In the days that followed, the use of the telephone to circumvent defenders became popular. The Russians took to entering the houses of citizens as they conquered the streets of Berlin. The first thing they did was look for the device to make random calls. They didn't care who answered, they just wanted it to be a German, so they could laugh at him. When a German answered the call, the Soviets announced his presence in a thick Russian accent, saying that they were getting closer and closer. For the communists this was a joke and a way to entertain themselves in the midst of the carnage that the battle for Berlin had become, but for the Germans, this had a devastating psychological effect. Their entire world was collapsing around them, and no one had any hope that the outcome of the war would be favorable for the Nazi Empire. All they saw on the horizon was more death and destruction. In fact, in the last days of April 1945, Berliners began to refer to the city as the funeral pyre of the Reich. Around those dates, there was a wave of massive suicides among the population of the capital, which demonstrates the level of demoralization that existed. The Soviets, whose sole aim was to fuel these sentiments, helped sow discord. Meanwhile, inside the Führer bunker, below the Chancellery building, Hitler and his generals were preoccupied with what was happening outside. They knew that things were going wrong, but they did not know the full gravity of the facts. The reason for their ignorance was that, inside the shelter, they did not have the proper equipment to communicate with the barracks, and this got worse as the days passed and the Soviets occupied the military establishments in Berlin. Hitler, however, refused to remain in the dark, and demanded to be informed of all German and Russian troop movements. Until the last minute he made an effort to control the fate of the war, even though it was already lost. To satisfy the wishes of the dictator, the generals resorted to a curious method of collecting information. They began calling private homes in Berlin, numbers they found in a phone book, hoping to reach citizens living on the outskirts of the city. If they managed to communicate with a German, then they would ask him to tell them if he had seen the Red Army, how many men they had, how they were equipped, and whether they had tanks or artillery. On other occasions, the person who answered the phone was a Soviet man, who responded with a barrage of insults in Russian. When the latter happened, then the Führer bunker officers already knew that the area they called had been captured. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide by shooting himself in the head, and in the following days many other Nazi leaders followed suit and took their own lives. Helmuth Weidling, in charge of the defense of Berlin, chose to ignore the Führer's order to resist to the last man, instead stopping the carnage by surrendering the city on May 2nd. Shortly after announcing to his troops that they would capitulate to the Soviets, he went into cardiac arrest. Although he did not die, he was arrested by the Red Army and transferred to the Soviet Union, where he died 10 years later as a prisoner. We have reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, what other cases do you know of victorious soldiers mocking defeated troops? Leave us your answer in the comment box below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.